Hello, this is David Bernstein, founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. This is the Jewish Contrarians podcast. I'm once again happy to have on William Kolbrener, who is a professor at Bar-Ilan University and a deep thinker on topics around Israel and the Jewish people. We had a previous podcast about 2 weeks ago that reflected deeply on what was happening in Israel and the US. And I think we're going to continue this conversation. It's an important conversation to have, both in terms of the Israeli experience and the American Jewish experience and how they relate. So, Bill, thank you so much for being with us again today. How's it feeling to be in Israel right now?
I think everybody is going through cycles now. I think we're in a kind of numb stage, where waiting, I think, as the rest of the world is, to see what will happen. I think also we're distracted, continue to be distracted every single day and every single night. There is just a new video that comes out that shows atrocities that we can't possibly imagine. And I think part of our attention is, of course, how this is being responded to or reported in America. We just made a wedding here, which was really very joyful under the circumstances. It was in a neighbor's yard, because it has to be outside, of course. And that was just about 50 people, the family. And then we crossed the street for the dancing down 4 flights of stairs to basically a reinforced, bomb shelter. And one of the people at the Sheva Brachot, the wedding blessings that I went to the Shabbat, said that he really loved the wedding because it represented a hesech hadas, which means in Hebrew, it allowed me to not think about everything else that was going on. And for me, it was the kivun hadas. It was a focusing, right? A determination. My daughter and her new husband are on TikTok, her new husband breaking the glass. And it was really beautiful because, sometimes these events just get taken up by other people. And this time the couple was the center, then the family was there, and then a bunch of yeshiva guys showed up. And it was just really explosive joy. I don't do that so often. I didn't do the explosive part, but I was happy. And I danced.
Great. While there's a lot of similarities in how American Jews, diaspora Jews more generally perhaps, and Israelis are experiencing this, I don't think it's identical. I was at this conference in Philly, for the book Jewish Priorities that you were supposed to be at as well, but couldn't end up making for obvious reasons. And we both have essays in this book, Jewish Priorities, that just came out or is coming out now. And it was really driven home to me when there were a couple of people who just came from Israel that I talked to, and they had experienced this in a different way. In addition to all the horror stories and perhaps being even more proximal and intimate, they were also experiencing the noise and the aftershocks of bombs that were perhaps mostly being taken care of by Iron Dome, but still creating sort of extra sensory experiences that I think many American Jews just don't grasp. So I felt that they were even more shaken up and in a state of shock and trauma than the people I knew among American Jews, who are also very traumatized. There was this blog that came out that went sort of viral about, it's titled something like "Your Jewish Friends Are Not Okay." And it's not something I would have written myself because I'm more analytical, but it really struck a nerve with a lot of Jews. And I think that, we're not okay. And we're not okay partly because of how we experienced anti-Semitism and hostility. Rabbi Sharon Brous, who is a progressive firebrand rabbi, very well known, very popular, did this sermon that was also reported in the New York Times. I think it's also gone viral. I just want to read a couple sentences from it. And this is from somebody who's tied her entire life to the progressive politics and the left. She said, to justify barbarity in the service of decolonization and the liberation of Palestine requires more than an ideological commitment to Palestinian freedom. It demands mental and emotional contortions that render a person fundamentally unable to see the humanity in a Jew. It requires a deep-rooted association with Jews in power, the Jew as oppressor, the Jew as victimizer. I mean, I just, so here you could see sort of a wake-up call among a lot of American Jews in this experience, and I think it's been a shock, different than an Israeli experiences, and perhaps maybe not that different, but different, and it's going to be interesting. Brett Stevens at the conference gave a very, it was on a panel, gave a very powerful presentation, and he used the phrase "October 8th Jews." He said, and he said, the October 8th Jews are people who understand what's just happened has to be considered a break with the radical left. An October 8th Jew cannot psychologically, and I'm feeling this and I'm editorializing a bit, but this is my interpretation. An October 8th Jew cannot see themselves psychologically and emotionally tied at the hip with any ideological party. It has to separate him or herself from that larger reality, and has to sort of set one's own agenda and invite others to the table, but not be beholden to others. And I thought that was a remarkably well thought out, framing, a powerful framing of the sort of existential condition of American Jews in the post-October 7th world we're entering. And I think that's going to take up a lot of our airtime, not our airtime, the two of us, but also in among diaspora Jews.
I really want to get back to that, but I want to talk a little bit about the Israel experience.
Yes.
Part of what I do at Bar Ilan is I teach creative nonfiction. We have a creative writing program. Creative nonfiction is one of three things that we teach: poetry, fiction, and creative nonfiction. And creative nonfiction workshops tend to be the most personal for obvious reasons, because the voice is the voice of the person. It might be a constructed voice, and we work on cultivating voice. So even though we haven't started university here, because none of them have, we've delayed 2 or 3 weeks, I brought together some of my CNF creative nonfiction students for an impromptu workshop. And I thought, because it's such a fraught time, I thought we'd just go right in with a writing prompt. But then I thought better of myself, and I went around the room on Zoom, and I asked 9 of them, what's going on in their lives. And I'm insulated from what happens in Israel because I brought up my kids Haredi, so they don't serve in the army. And when I heard the stories of these students, one, a woman with 4 kids, her husband is up on the Northern Front. Another's son-in-law is going through charred bodies in the South and trying to identify them. That's a trauma for life. There's another whose best friend was murdered, and et cetera, et cetera. Like, each one of these stories, just it stunned me. And people talk about the 9/11 comparisons. It would be 50,000 or whatever, and that number is only significant insofar that it means that everybody here knows somebody. Everybody. Yeah. This is a trauma that has not spared anybody. Yeah. And you're right. The American trauma, I think, is entirely different. For us, we are numb. And as I said to you last time, we are united and determined, but things are very, very tense here.
Yeah. Yes, that's very thoughtful. And it was interesting. There was one young woman who came from Israel who had seen a video of, probably an American college campus, where a young woman was ripping down posters of Israeli kidnapped children. And there was a young Israeli man, clearly, because I could tell by the accent, who kept on saying, "Why are you ripping them? These are just children. Why?" And she wouldn't say anything. She just kept on ripping. And she saw that video, and she had also seen such a poster on the outside of her hotel the night before. And then when she came up this morning, it was gone. And I could tell she was just very emotional by that. Now, and I was emotional, by the way. That video was deeply disturbing to me as well. The as Sharon Brous put it, the mental contortions one has to go through to think that you should be able to rip down posters of Israeli children who have been kidnapped by Hamas terrorists. But I think it shows that how indelible of a mark this is making on the Israeli psyche and how it's going to change. She was saying that she's a young woman, very progressive Israeli in her late 20s, and she was going out to get a gun. She told her boyfriend, "We need to have a gun now," and they live in Tel Aviv. And it just shows you that I think it's going to be a long process of healing as well as fighting a war at the same time.
I think, David, you're really right, and we're not up to healing. We're just not there yet, and I think that we're not asking any of the questions that America are asking. Pardon?
You have too much to do.
Exactly. I wanted to ask you, David. Can I just ask you? You were talking about this progressive rabbi, and inspiring. But I just have a practical question. Where does she and her followers go now? Meaning, and I think this goes back to a question we were asking last time, is what conversations do they now become part of or get included in? And are they willing to say we made a set of wrong judgments?
Yeah, I think that is the $64,000 question. I'm not sure what they're willing to do and not do. Now, they may say we're going to double down on dialogue on the progressive left because it's even more necessary than before, but understand that they have some rabid anti-Semites in their midst. So that's one possible response to it. Some may say that they simply can't go on like this, and they're going to jump ship. I think you're going to see some of that. It depends on where they were before, how closely tied in they were to the far left. I got a message from a longtime friend who became, let's say, a little bit woke, and runs a large Jewish human service organization. It was my birthday a couple of days ago. So she said, "Happy birthday."
Oh,
yeah, my gift to you is to say you were right. I am living and breathing woke anti-Semitism every day for my human service colleagues. It's exhausting. There's more of that where it came from. I mean, the one of the most prominent diversity, equity, and inclusion trainers in the United States wrote me a letter also basically doing tshuva for not seeing the problem. Now, here's the thing and this goes back to your question, what do they do with this? See, it's also how do they interpret it? So if you notice that Rabbi Browse's comments said, yes, that they're tying Jews to power. She didn't say that the larger ideology that does that routinely is problematic. She's just saying that there's a problematic symptom of it as it applies to Jews. And I'm suggesting that the big mental and intellectual breakthrough will be when they say this ideology that divides people up by virtue of their identity and places them either in an oppressed category or a privileged category is itself going to lead inexorably to the view of Jewish power. And that shouldn't be what we talk about or preach. It doesn't mean that there aren't oppressed people in the world. Doesn't mean that we're not going to name oppression when we're confident that we see it, but we're not going to shut the conversation down around these issues anymore because we realize that that's just too dogmatic and it leads others to categorize us in that fashion. I don't know to what degree they'll make that leap. And to me, that's absolutely critical because once you agree that there's a larger ideological problem, it's not just a Jewish problem. Once you agree to that, it carries implications because it now means you have to ask yourself, who are my friends? Because I'm not just trying to convince the people who didn't link Jews to power. I'm now dealing with a larger ideology that will continue to do so. And I have to ask myself, are those the people I want to hang out with anymore?
Well, David, I wake up every morning and feel like I'm happy to be in Jerusalem because I don't know what it would be like to be on an American college campus right now.
Yeah, and it
And
depends on which
and
campus, by the way.
okay.
I mean, like your community college in whatever place might be fine, but
Mm,
Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Penn, and maybe a lot of state colleges, depending Wisconsin, Northwestern, may not be
mm,
fine. Probably aren't fine.
mm, mhm. Right. I think one of the things that we were really stunned by here was the report on after Shabbat that 500 people had been killed in a massacre initiated by the IDF and an IDF missile. It's a little bit like the Algeria story of the Palestinian journalist who was killed.
Yeah.
Immediately, the story was told and it was finished. And that story is proven to be completely wrong, not an Israeli missile, not the hospital is entirely intact, and there were 10 to 50 people who were killed. And yet, all of the news agencies in the world, BBC, New York Times, AP, Reuters, Sky, they printed it without confirmation immediately.
Yeah. Yeah.
And no matter what happened afterwards, that story has fueled the anger across the world against Israel.
I know.
Even though we didn't do it, we wanted to do it. That's the mentality. The
Right.
anti-Semitism we're seeing is so, so deep and so powerful and so subtle that even some Jews do not even notice it. I have a friend who works in government for 30 years, a Democrat. He says, no, the New York Times is not biased. They often give the Israeli angle on Hamas atrocities. So the idea still in some people's brains that there's a moral equivalency or a legitimacy equivalency between Hamas and Israel, it's just so stunning. The willed ignorance is so stunning. I don't know if it's contortions or just inertia.
I don't know. There might be a little bit of both depending on who you're talking about. My wife, who's a convert to Judaism, said that until 2 weeks ago, she didn't fully grasp anti-Semitism. And she's been very traumatized, and like the rest of us, watching whatever news she can get 24/7 and the rest. And she just could not believe the double standards and the blood libel. And I think that hospital situation was truly shocking, and that people jumped to that. Batya Unger Sargon really put it powerfully, and I'm not going to do justice to exactly what she said on, I think it was a Fox News show, but she said the fact that these newspapers were willing to print that so easily, but then drop the story like hotcakes as soon as it changed, said that they only liked the story because it cast Israel and Jews as the oppressor. Like, that's what it did. That's what the story did, and that's why it fit with their sort of preconceived narratives about the conflict, and that's why they were eager to print it in the way that they did. It took me, and it really caused lasting damage. And I have to say, I think the soul searching among these papers has been quite lame. Like, they keep on justifying, well, it's a wartime situation. Yeah, it's a wartime situation, and things aren't always clear. Then they don't print it. Nate Silver, the great, political analyst and pollster, said, what about the headline? Nate Silver sees UFO over Madison Square Garden. Nate Silver says, or something like that. He said you don't print that because without verifying it. And the worst part of that, by the way, the most laughable part of, it's not laughable, but of the New York Times thing, is the initial picture was of a building that wasn't the hospital, that was absolutely wrecked, and it didn't even label it as such. I mean, shocking. But
right.
I sometimes listen to Yossi Klein Halevi and Danielle Hartman podcast from the Hartman Institute, and they were reflecting on that incident, and it was interesting. Danielle said when he heard that there were 500 people killed, he got deeply, deeply depressed, and he also took the headlines for granted, like they must know something. And he said, maybe we can't fight this war. If that's the human toll that we have to impose on the other side, maybe we can't fight this war. Yossi had a very different perspective, Yossi said if we had done that and it, as he would have assumed, it would have been accidental, we'd have to sort of pause, find our wits and continue the war because you have to fight the war. That was his moral attitude, which would have been mine as well. But you can see what that does, not just to the way that Israel's treated internationally, but even the Israeli psyche. I mean, Israel needs to fight a war. It's a moral war that will have a lot of casualties on the other side, as it is. And so I think that this would have, and that's part of why this was such an emotional roller coaster for us, because we went from being sort of morally mortified to morally indignant overnight without, and just, anyway, I'm just venting.
It's amazing how Palestinians continually appropriate our narrative and just continually turn themselves into the victim, no matter what happens. And it's as if somehow they really were victims. And we're seeing pictures supposedly of Palestinian babies, right? Because they're always mirroring the things that they've done to us and saying that we've done it to them. And everybody in the West somehow believes this.
Yeah.
I really
the
wonder.
Good news is that not everybody in the West, and maybe this is the thing that we have to get through our skulls as Jews,
right,
is that
right.
Look, the head of state of France is on his way. I don't know if he's
right.
Biden came. So we have a lot of sympathy right now. And the story on CNN and Fox, while giving some airtime to Gaza suffering, is still mostly about what they did to us.
I understand that, and it's not as my great uncle Morty used to say. It's all the goyim who hate us. It's just some of the goyim who hate us, right? But the ground invasion has not even begun.
Right.
And when pictures show up day after day after day after day of Israeli attacks on Gaza, I think maybe the heads of state will stay with us. I'm not concerned about them. I'm concerned about the universities. I'm concerned about the universities and turning into the streets, as we already saw in London. As there seem to be a lot of people.
And by the way, New York City, there's been some horrible demonstrations, in Brooklyn and so forth, where my son lives. He's subjected to it every day. I think that there's real dangers of this really spilling over in that way. I think that's a good point. So it's the 10% of society that hates Israel and hates Jews that's quite dangerous, even if it's just 10%.
So David, I think that's really the key point here is, and we were talking last time about meaning making, and this goes back to what you were saying as well about the rabbi. And I asked, where does she go? And I still think that we have this problem of being able to become more inclusive in the kinds of conversations that we're having. The Institute for Jewish Liberal Values really should accommodate all of these different voices, and we should reassert the principles of toleration and democracy. To me, this fight against anti-Semitism is really a fight for democracy, because if we don't get rid of anti-Semitism, absolutism will follow. We're the first, but not the only. So
we are the first and not the only.
I just wonder what's happening in humanities classes now in Ivy League institutions. What's happening in there?
I think that they're horrible. And, one of the things we're going to have to ask ourselves when we're, in the longer term as we're fighting this is, can we challenge fundamentally the state of the humanities without being tarnished with with shutting down academic freedom? I mean, there's no reason why a university has to have departments that themselves do not engage in open discourse, that are ideologically driven and so forth, where every professor is basically an ideologue and an activist. And there's no reason why they have to prioritize that type of teaching. Just as they didn't have it before, they don't have to have it in the future. And I think ultimately, we're going to need more and more universities to say, we're out of that business. Not that means that they're not going to teach about post-colonialism, but we're not going to have entire departments that have a political mission. And because I don't know how else you fix it. It's structural in that way. And so to really fix this problem in the long run, in my view, the tide has to turn such that there's a critical mass of donors, university administrators, and others who just want to restore the credibility of higher education and work to do so. And I think that's a big lift that we're up against. But this might be the
You're
most
talking about
profound disturbance in
Hmm.
discourse that might help push that over.
Well, as you said, and we said this last time, October 7th was a key moment in Jewish history. And what Brett Stevens says about there being October 8th Jews is especially resonant in this context.
Yeah.
That is, people who are now going to find themselves homeless. And when I think of these humanities classrooms, there are Jews in those classrooms. And what happened? I was wondering if you were just talking about Middle Eastern studies departments or whole humanities faculties.
No, I'm not. I'm not talking about just Middle Eastern studies departments at all. I actually think the bigger problem is these ethnic and gender studies and the like. I mean that took hold in the late 1960s, and these departments, that put out statements on the academic boycott in Israel and so forth, the whole department. To me, that's highly problematic. It's going to be hard, and it's a multi-generational project to sort of shift it back to sort of open discourse and critical thinking and the like. But I think it has to start with some of those structural changes. Maybe it's at a few universities that do it in the beginning, and they set the pace for everybody else. And it's a slower process than getting rid of whole departments overnight. I suspect that's the case, but universities have to see that they're losing their credibility in society, and that people aren't going to send their kids to these places anymore.
I think what you're emphasizing now, this idea of open discourse and critical thinking, which is what you write about all the time, I know, that's something that we have to see as a challenge, I think, outside of the university, to try to provide resources for students who are not getting what they need inside the university.
Yes.
And not to resort to the kind of hasbara. I know that the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs is trying very hard here, but to me, they show too many horrible videos without providing the language that's needed to understand and frame them. Okay, yes. So we're horrified. Okay, so our friends have betrayed us. Okay, so their minds are are twisted and turned. But how do we educate those people further? Because I really think that they are stuck now. They're stuck in an extremely hostile environment, but they're also stuck cognitively because they never learned how to read, because their professors taught them that not reading was better than reading. So every single text is a marker of oppression or sexism. That's the first thing you do. It's just a checklist, which means that students have not shown themselves open up to the possibility of hearing another voice. And you see that in reading, and you see that in classroom pedagogy. So I have students who I've heard of who say, "Don't you dare talk to me." Right? Well, I'm an expert on the situation. Then really don't you dare talk to me. Expertise is disqualifying, right?
Right.
So
because my narrative matters just as much as your narrative. Right.
I was asking about the humanities, but I know how sick it is. And I think it really is upon people like us and the organizations that we're affiliated with to provide a framework, some kind of outside framework to help our students. Would you want to be an undergraduate at Princeton, or maybe Princeton, Stanford or Columbia or University of Wisconsin or Michigan? I wouldn't want to be. It's terrifying.
Yeah. I was a pro-Israel activist during the first Intifada. It's gotten worse, so I'm not trying to compare, but it was a pretty crazy time. And I would show up at large Palestinian rallies on campus and so forth, and with my Israeli flag. So I've been there, done that, but I'm not the average 19-year-old or whatever. But the other thing that you got me thinking about is that we need to teach kids frameworks like just war theory. I mean, that's been worked out for generations. I was looking at the numbers. The U.S. forces killed 30,000 civilians during the campaign against ISIS. Now, that's a harsh thing to say, and somebody got really angry at me on Twitter. Somebody who I think probably agreed with me on a lot of things. It just felt very insensitive just to say that. But my point about that is that we have to understand what war is. It stopped. It ended ISIS's march through the Arab world and taking of sex slaves and mass murdering, but it cost 30,000 civilians in the process, and so that's a kind of cold calculation one makes during wars. And I don't think people have a framework for that. By the way, it was almost not talked about. Like, I had to do some real digging to find out how many civilians were killed in the US ISIS campaign. The mainstream press didn't really report on it. People assumed that it was a just war and that everything that the United States or UK did was just within that war. And there was very little analysis of the human trade-offs, because those were not the Arab victims that they cared about for whatever reason. And so I think we've got to help people understand it. It already gave me some ideas of like what educational videos and guides you can have. Like, let's talk about war and understand how it usually manifests.
I think also we need a reintroduction of a lot of the words that we threw away because we thought they were not useful anymore, or because we thought they were based upon false assumptions. The Jewish people have enemies. We have enemies, and that to internalize that is kind of the prerequisite for the war theory. We have to recognize that there are people who really want to wipe us off the face of the earth. And this is just a continuation from the long view of history of the Holocaust. The Muslim fundamentalism is just a different tip of the spear for those anti-Semites who've wanted to kill us for millennia. And even as I'm speaking, I can hear, people, progressives saying, what do you mean? And we're forced to kind of, just like some spokespeople for the Israeli government are forced to show these atrocities so people will believe us. It's like, please believe us what's happening. And in a way, it doesn't matter what we show them, because there is a kind of cognitive gear inside of people's heads in the Western world. There's an anti-Semitic gene at this point. I agree with you, David, and I hear there are maybe 10% or 15% or 10% on this side and 10% on that side. But when they tend to dominate the discourse and there's nothing in the middle, that's the problem. And at the moment, there's nothing in the middle, which is, I keep on going back to the rabbi. Where does she go? She's not going to the right-wing extreme. And that's the available perspective now, because they're the only people who talk. That's why I think, again, our voices and people like us are so important.
We have to create a new table. This is the October 8th Jew has to create their own political party. And I mean that figuratively, not literally. And it has to demonstrate some political independence. Now, I don't know if Rabbi Brous will move in that direction, but I think that's the direction that we need to shift American Jewry to. That's the stance, that's our role in society. And that's very hard for us, because we're so, American Jews in particular, in contrast to other diaspora communities, are so tied to the hip with, the Democratic Party in particular. And I'm not saying vote Democratic, vote Republican. That's not what we're talking about. You're going to vote, and you'll probably vote for one or two parties, but rather our psychological and intellectual independence is, I think, a necessary condition to sort of navigate this new reality. I want to read to you a quote from Michael Oren, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, in the Wall Street Journal today, and it sort of hits what you were saying, and maybe it's a good place to wrap it up. Israel has to destroy Hamas because the attack of October 7th threatens the country's existence. If the conflict ends in stalemate or ceasefire, the terrorists will have gotten away with mass atrocities on Israeli soil. We will never be secure from future onslaughts. Tourism and foreign investment will vanish, and many Israelis will raise their children elsewhere. Victory is necessary to reestablish Israeli deterrence. Most critically, though, victory is necessary to preserve the idea of Israel, the reason for our existence. I don't think people understand that when we're not, yes, Hamas is not going to go and destroy the IDF. There's no Hamas version of the 6-day war, but there is a Hamas version of just absolutely devastating Israeli society to the point where the country feels unlivable. And that's why Israel has to fight. And that's why all of these ridiculous calls for ceasefires are absolutely unacceptable and have to be rejected. And they're not pro-peace, they're pro-war. And so anyway, I think we've got to help people understand the kind of points that Oren is making there. That's what people have to understand. We have to equip our young people with that kind of ammunition, so that they can and also sense of self, so that they can navigate these very choppy waters ahead.
I would just add one thing to what Michael Oren said. It's not only Israel's existence, but it really is liberalism in the West.
Yes.
Because if we allow Israel to go, the Jew has always been the other. The Jew is the other. And the Jew has finally stood up. And, you know, I think maybe for other people, never again is a slogan. For Jews in Israel, never again. It is the living reality for everybody.
Right.
Nobody's thinking of a ceasefire here. Nobody, left, right, nobody.
Right.
Because we know what happened to our children and to the women and to whole families.
Yes.
Never again.
Never again. All right, Bill. Well, listen, let's check in another week or so, and continue to sort of share our observations and thinking, sometimes out loud. And I appreciate it, and please stay safe.
Thank you, David.